Welcome to the Roman Forum in the Age of Augustus, a walking tour created for Toldinstone.com. My name is Garrett Ryan. I earned my doctorate in Greek and Roman history from the University of Michigan, and have taught in the history and classics departments of several universities. I wrote this tour to help visitors understand the Roman Forum. Even with a good guidebook, it can be difficult to see the Forum as more than a few acres of unshaded rubble, and many visitors simply hurry through on their way to more dramatic sites. My goal is to bring the Forum to life by exploring the part it played in the Age of Augustus, arguably the most fascinating and pivotal period in Roman history. The political career of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, lasted nearly 60 years. It began in 44 BCE, when the future Augustus was a sickly boy of 18, known, if at all, as the great-nephew of Julius Caesar. By the time it ended, Augustus was nearly 80, and his name was known and respected from England to India. The imperial system he established over the course of his long reign set the pattern for the rest of Roman history, and profoundly influenced the evolution of Europe. Roman emperors would reign over some part of the Mediterranean world for an incredible 15 centuries. When Constantine XI fell to a Janissary bullet in 1453, he died as emperor of the Romans, and as a direct political heir of Augustus. It was here, in the Roman Forum, that the remarkable career and legacy of Augustus took shape. Using the extant ruins as points of reference, this tour will trace the first emperor's story, from its origins in the populist dictatorship of Julius Caesar to the grandiose funeral that marked its end. Imagine away the tourists and the sound of traffic. Line the Forum Square behind you with colonnades 70 feet tall. Crown the Palatine Hill to your right with shining stucco walls and red tile roofs, and pave with polished marble the dust beneath your feet. Imagine that it is a sunny, rather brisk day in March of 44 BCE. A light breeze stings your skin and assails your nostrils with the blended aromas of smoke, dung, and roast chickpeas. Standing on one of the wooden benches ranged along this side of the Forum, you can see over the heads of the crowd that fills the Forum Square, gray-haired, black-haired, brunette and bald, punctuated here and there by a prostitute's blonde wig. Most of these heads belong to commoners, but you can pick out a few senators, distinguished by their immaculate, purple-striped togas and protective rings of slaves. About 20 feet ahead, Julius Caesar's funeral couch is stuck in the crowd. Although the body is invisible from your vantage point, you can see Caesar's cloak, carried on a pole to display the 23 bloody gashes left by the assassin's daggers. You can also see the front ranks of the funeral procession, where the hired mourners wail and members of the Julian clan march behind the death masks of their ancestors. Suddenly, a brawl breaks out around the body. Guards stationed around the funeral couch rush into the crowd with raised clubs, but after a few minutes they're beaten back. The purple-robed pallbearers panic, dropping the funeral couch to the pavement. In the confusion, someone sets a torch to Caesar's funeral couch, and it bursts into flames. The crowd cheers and begins ripping newly budded branches off nearby trees to feed the fire. A group of men tears up the wooden benches of the tribunal and heaps them on the makeshift pyre. Offerings begin to rain onto the flames from every side. The musicians from the funeral procession throw in their robes and instruments. Caesar's veterans toss on pieces of their armor. Women contribute their jewelry. Soon, the funeral couch disappears beneath a massive heap of half-burnt offerings, licked by lazy tongues of bluish flame. To return to the past tense, that is how Julius Caesar was cremated. The ceremony was supposed to take place in the Campus Martius, near the later site of the Pantheon, but the Roman people, who adored Caesar, spontaneously decided to honor him with a funeral in the Forum itself, with the results just described. A few years later, Caesar's political heirs had the Senate declare him a god, and began to construct an imposing temple dedicated to Divus Julius, the deified Julius, at the eastern end of the Forum Square. The front of this temple's podium was built around a circular altar that marked the spot of Caesar's cremation. Part of this altar survives today, though the temple itself is long gone. The ruins are not especially impressive, but they mark the place where the Age of Augustus, and thus the Roman imperial era, began. You are standing in front of the Curia, the primary meeting place of the Roman Senate. The building you see is a 3rd century reconstruction of one begun by Julius Caesar shortly before his assassination. Though structurally intact, it's rather plain now, having lost almost all of its decoration. Imagine the whole building wrapped in glittering marble and stucco, roofed with gilded shingles, and crowned by bronze statues, and you'll have some idea of how ancient Romans saw it. As it stands, however, the story behind its construction is perhaps more interesting than the building itself. During the last week of January, 52 BCE, the old Curia burned to the ground in circumstances typical of the Roman Republic's turbulent last years. A few days before, Publius Clodius Pulcher, a populist politician, had encountered his enemy Titus Annius Milo on the Appian Way, just south of Rome. Clodius was accompanied by 30 armed slaves. Milo had a retinue of hired gladiators. As the two groups passed, one of Milo's gladiators shoved one of Clodius's slaves. A fight broke out, in which Clodius was struck by a javelin. Badly wounded, he retreated to a nearby inn, where Milo's gladiators attacked and killed him. After Clodius's mangled body was discovered by a passerby, it was carried into the Forum by a mob of Roman commoners, who decided, in a move that foreshadowed Caesar's funeral 8 years later, to cremate it in front of the Curia. Predictably, the Curia caught fire and was reduced to rubble. By the time of Clodius's murder, the Republic was in a state of terminal decline. The Republic was an oligarchy, centered on the council known as the Senate. In theory, the Senate's 300 and later 600 members, who were chosen for life from Rome's leading families, merely advised. In reality, the Senate's immense prestige gave it effective control of the state. Senators competed fiercely for political office. The chief magistrates were the two consuls, who led Rome's armies and presided over meetings of the Senate during their joint one-year term. The consuls were aided by subordinate officials, who likewise served annual terms and shared their powers with colleagues. The whole system was designed to ensure that most, if not all, members of Rome's leading families would have a chance to gain the all-important prestige conferred by high government office. The greatest prize was the consulship, both because it was the chief magistracy and because it afforded a chance to lead armies against Rome's enemies. Victory in battle was the ultimate source of political and social capital, and as a result, major campaigns were launched virtually every year. Thus the Republic, driven to constantly seize territory by the dynamics of elite competition and the sheer profitability of conquest, expanded more or less continuously for most of its existence. The greatest successes came in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, when Roman armies conquered much of the Mediterranean basin. In the years that followed, however, the Republic became increasingly unstable. The institutions of the Republic, which had evolved to govern a small city-state, were completely inadequate to the task of running a Mediterranean-spanning empire. And so, in the late 2nd century BCE, the same dynamics that had brought so much territory under Roman control began to tear the state apart. Armies campaigned farther and farther from Italy, sometimes for years at a time, and soldiers came to be tied more closely to their commanders than to the government. The massive flow of wealth from Rome's new provinces was overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of the senatorial elite, and since Roman aristocrats tended to invest in colossal slave-worked estates, tens of thousands of farmers were forced from their lands and into the crowded slums of Rome, where they became easy prey for unscrupulous politicians. In the Senate itself, any semblance of consensus gave way to infighting between loose alliances centered on, or opposed to, exceptionally powerful generals and politicians. The clashes of these leading figures became increasingly bloody in the Republic's final years, and culminated in the civil war between Sulla, a general who supported the traditional oligarchy, and the followers of Marius, his populist rival. After Sulla won the war, he declared himself dictator. This act sent a fatal precedent. Every ambitious Roman now knew that, given the right circumstances and a willing army, the Republic was his for the taking. This was the world in which Julius Caesar came of age. The plaza in front of you is the Forum proper, the open square that served for centuries as Rome's most important place of political assembly. It was, of course, much more impressive in the age of Augustus. Then, the long sides were bounded by the 2-story colonnades of colossal basilicas. The ends were crowned by the pediments of temples, and the whole space was filled with the glow of marble and the shimmer of bronze. On the evening of September 26, 46 BC, both sides of the road you're standing on were lined by men and women carrying lit torches. Here and there, elephants bearing huge lamps were stationed along the roadside as makeshift streetlights. On the left side of the street, 2 especially imposing elephants flanked the central bay in a long portico of 20-foot columns. Between the elephants, wearing a garland of flowers and a purple toga trimmed with gold, stood a tall, thin man. His face showed the lines of his 54 years, and torchlight glinted on his balding scalp, poorly concealed by a comb-over. There were, however, no signs of age in his fluid, high-pitched voice as he finished the formulas of dedication. He closed with a flourish, arms outstretched. "And so, Romans, by the favor of the gods and in the service of justice, I, Caius Julius Caesar, Pontifex Maximus and Triumphator, dedicate this basilica." A deafening cheer drowned out the rest. The building Caesar dedicated that September evening was the largest and most magnificent on the Forum. Like all buildings of its type, the Basilica Julia was a large, rectangular structure designed to provide a covered space for commercial, and especially legal, business. The Basilica Julia was the regular meeting place of the centumviral court, which dealt primarily with inheritance disputes. Romans with time on their hands often passed their afternoons in the second-floor galleries, where they applauded the lawyers' speeches and listened avidly to the juicy details of the cases. The Basilica Julia was only part of Caesar's transformation of the Forum into a unified monumental space. Besides the Curia, which he began to rebuild about the same time he dedicated the Basilica Julia, Caesar constructed an imposing new Rostra, or speaker's platform, at the head of the Forum Square. More dramatically, he built an entire new forum just north of the Curia, dominated by a temple of the goddess Venus, the mythical ancestress of the Julian clan. The money for all these projects came from Caesar's wars in Gaul, roughly modern France. Even after paying his troops, Caesar was able to display an incredible 63,000 talents, that is, about 3.5 million pounds, of Gallic silver in his triumphal procession. In the weeks after his triumph, he spent much of this money on a series of lavish public spectacles, which featured, among much else, the first giraffe ever seen in Rome, a fight to the death between 2 teams of 1,000 condemned prisoners, each equipped with 20 war elephants, and a gladiatorial exhibition in the Forum Square itself, for which temporary stands and awnings of outrageously expensive purple silk were set up on the spot where you're now standing. Once his triumphal celebrations were over, however, Caesar continued to funnel his Gallic spoils into construction on the Forum. Like those silk-shaded gladiatorial combats and that hapless giraffe, the new buildings were intended to advertise Caesar's generosity and, implicitly, to celebrate his victory in the most savage civil war in Roman history. Julius Caesar was born into an ancient but not recently distinguished family. As a young man, he became famous for his rhetorical ability, and notorious for the burning ambition that led him to politics at an early age. In 60 BCE, Caesar gained the consulship with the help of Pompey, Rome's greatest general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. After his year as consul, Caesar was given a special 5-year governorship over 3 provinces just north of Italy. One of these provinces bordered the territories of the independent Gallic tribes, which had recently been thrown into turmoil by a migrating Germanic tribe. Sensing opportunity, Caesar launched a campaign that rapidly developed into an extremely bloody and extremely profitable war of conquest. Caesar kept the people of Rome informed of his exploits by composing the famous Commentaries, a series of carefully composed dispatches in which he presented himself as an ideal general and soldier. By 50 BCE, all of Gaul was in Roman hands, and Caesar was a hero. Trouble, however, waited back in Rome, where Pompey, growing jealous of his former ally's fame, conspired with the Senate to have Caesar arrested. Caesar responded by crossing the Rubicon and invading Italy. The following year, Caesar decisively defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. Although Pompey was assassinated shortly thereafter, The war was continued for years by Pompey's former allies in the Senate and provinces. Victorious against these challengers in a series of campaigns, Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE to dedicate his new projects in and around the Forum and to celebrate 4 consecutive triumphs. During a triumph, a Roman general became, in effect, king for a day. His face painted red, he rode in a gilded chariot up the sacred way, captives and spoils preceding him, his troops marching behind. The procession ended at the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, that is, Jupiter best and greatest, which stood on the left side of the hill you're now facing. By the late Republic, triumphs had become extremely elaborate, often incorporating musicians, painted dioramas, and long wagon trains of plunder. Caesar's 4 triumphs were the most elaborate on record. The first and most spectacular was the long-deferred triumph for his victory in the Gallic Wars, in which Caesar's greatest opponent, the chieftain Vercingetorix, was marched to his execution. Other highlights included 3 huge placards bearing Caesar's famous adage, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Finding himself in complete control of the government, Caesar had the Senate declare him dictator and undertook a series of far-reaching reforms. The most famous of these was his overhaul of the Roman calendar, which had fallen out of sync with the seasons. Caesar decreed that every year would have 365 days, with an extra day added every 4th year. With some adjustments made in the 16th century, this is the calendar we still use today. Appropriately enough, the Senate would later order the old month of Quintilis to be renamed Julius, our July, in Caesar's honor. Caesar's grandiose plans and autocratic manner offended many senators. On the Ides of March, that is, March 15th, 44 BCE, a group of the most disgruntled, led by Brutus and Cassius, murdered Caesar in the portico of Pompey's theater on the Campus Martius. Caesar's body, as you know, was cremated in the Forum a few days later. You should see a low brick wall. This is what remains of the Rostra, the speaker's platform rebuilt by Caesar as part of his reorganization of the Forum. The Rostra derived its name from the Rostra, that is, rams from enemy ships, with which it was decorated. The original Rostra stood near the Curia, beside the ancient place of assembly known as the Comitium. Caesar moved it to its current position around 46 BCE. The Rostra had many ceremonial uses. In later centuries, the bodies of Roman emperors were displayed here before being cremated in towering pyres in the Campus Martius. Some emperors also received ambassadors and visiting dignitaries on the Rostra. Nero, for example, staged an elaborate reception for the king of Armenia here. The platform was, however, first and foremost a place for orators to address the Roman people, and it is in that capacity that it figures in our story. On December 8th, 43 BCE, 2 slaves climbed the steps of the Rostra. One carried 3 sharpened stakes and a coil of rope. The other bore a large covered basket. Working together, they fastened the base of each stake to the Rostra's front. Then, uncovering the basket, they removed 2 severed hands. Without ceremony, they impaled these hands on the outer spikes. One of the slaves returned to the basket and removed the head of an old man. Grasping the head by its thinning hair, he carried it to his partner. The 2 slaves placed themselves on either side of the head, and, after a whispered argument about which way it was supposed to go, jammed it onto the center spike. As they withdrew, a herald, looking a little queasy, came up to the platform. Standing just behind the dripping stakes, he addressed the crowd gathered in the Forum Square. Romans, behold the head of Marcus Tullius Cicero, prescribed on the orders of our protectors the Triumviri. May all enemies of the Republic thus perish. This gruesome episode was a product of the chaos that followed Caesar's death, when Caesar's adopted son Octavian and Caesar's hard-drinking lieutenant Marcus Antonius teamed up to fight Brutus and Cassius, and then, after an uneasy alliance, turned on each other. After the Ides of March, when Caesar's will was opened, he was found to have posthumously adopted his 18-year-old great-nephew Octavian. The boy, who was studying in Greece at the time, was not physically impressive. Short and frail, he was often sick, and so prone to chills that he wrapped his arms and legs in thick layers of cloth in all but the warmest weather. He had, however, a keen mind and superb political instincts, and as soon as he learned that Caesar was dead, and that he was Caesar's heir, he took ship for Italy and raced to Rome. Initially, the conspirators had established an uneasy truce with Caesar's friends and allies, who were led by Marcus Antonius, one of Caesar's best generals and most trusted political associates. Then, a few days after the assassination, Antonius climbed the Rostra and delivered Caesar's eulogy. At the end of this speech, made famous by Shakespeare, he held up Caesar's cloak, torn by the assassin's daggers, and so roused the people that mobs drove bruising Cassius from the city. Young Octavian arrived in Rome soon after. For a few months, he sided with the Senate against Antonius, but by the summer, recognizing each other as natural allies, Octavian and Antonius had reconciled and joined with the Caesarian general Lepidus to create the political alliance known as the Second Triumvirate. As part of their agreement, the political enemies of each man were sentenced to death. Prominent among the condemned was Antonius's most stubborn opponent, the great orator Cicero. On Cicero's early career, I humbly refer you to the second episode of My History of Rome in 15 Buildings at Toldinstone.com. After Caesar's death, Cicero, hoping to restore the old republic, had clashed with Marcus Antonius. Relying on the support of Octavian, Cicero decided to have Antonius declared a public enemy by the Senate. To that end, he composed the 14 speeches known as the Philippics, at least 2 of which were delivered from the Rostra. In these orations, Cicero savagely criticized Antonius's party-hardy private life and slapdash public conduct. Antonius, it must be said, was not difficult to critique in this way. Once, for example, when speaking on the Rostra after a long night of drinking, he vomited into a fold of his toga in front of the assembled Roman people. After he was condemned, Cicero fled to one of his own villas, which feels like a bad way to avoid assassins, and sure enough, he was hunted down and executed almost immediately. The head and hands were brought back to Antonius and to the Rostra. You are standing beside the ruins of the Arch of Augustus. Only a few battered foundation blocks remain today. When it was new, however, this was a spectacular triple gateway of pure marble, crowned by a glittering array of bronze statues. For contemporaries, as we shall see, its symbolic significance was even more impressive than its appearance. The story of the arch begins 1,500 miles east of Rome, on the baking plain of Carrhae. There, in May 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, Caesar's political ally, fell with 20,000 of his soldiers beneath a hail of Parthian arrows. Parthia, a large empire centered in what is now Iraq and Iran, was Rome's greatest rival in the Near East, and although the immediate political and military effects were relatively minor, the defeat represented a serious blow to Roman prestige, especially since the Parthians had managed to capture 3 legionary eagles. A legion's eagle was its standard, honored as the enduring symbol of its courage and victories. When not being carried in battle, the eagle was stationed in a small shrine near the commander's tent, where soldiers could revere it alongside statues of the deified emperors. The loss of 3 eagles, in short, was not something the Romans could just shrug off. Shortly before his assassination, Caesar was known to be planning a punitive expedition into Parthia. A few years later, Antonius launched a full-scale, if abortive, invasion, and managed to lose 2 more eagles in the process. So it was left to Caesar's heir, young Octavian, to redeem this blot on Roman honor. After the establishment of the Second Triumvirate, Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators were hunted down and slain, and, after Lepidus had been pushed aside, Octavian, still only in his early 20s, emerged as one of the 2 most powerful men in the Roman Empire. By informal agreement, Octavian and Antonius divided the provinces between them. While Octavian remained in Rome, orchestrating the defeat of Pompey's last remaining son, Antonius spent the bulk of his time in the east, where, like Caesar before him, he became the lover of Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Neglecting his wife in Rome, who happened to be Octavian's sister, Antonius made Cleopatra his consort and had 3 children with her. For this and other reasons, the relationship between Octavian and Antonius, always a matter of convenience, gradually cooled. Octavian began to wage a propaganda war against his rival, presenting himself as the protector of traditional Roman values, and criticizing Antonius as the debauched slave of Cleopatra. Finally, in 31 BCE, Octavian convinced the Senate to declare war on Antonius. The decisive moment in the ensuing conflict was the naval battle of Actium, where Octavian's forces faced those of Antonius and Cleopatra. For hours, the forces seemed evenly matched, until, for mysterious reasons, Cleopatra's galleys withdrew from the fight. Antonius turned to follow her, and the battle turned into a rout. Octavian pursued his enemies to Alexandria, where both Antonius and Cleopatra committed suicide. Egypt became a province, and Octavian returned in triumph to Rome. For centuries, the beaks of Cleopatra's galleys were displayed just to your left, embedded in the podium of Caesar's temple. No one knew what to expect after Actium. Octavian had the absolute loyalty of 50 legions, and, having seized the wealth of Egypt, he had the money to pay them. If he wished, there was nothing to prevent him from ruling Rome as a king. But Octavian was far too savvy to attempt anything so ham-fisted. After triumphing, he formally laid down his unconstitutional powers, proclaimed the restoration of the Republic, and took on a new role as princeps, or first citizen, of the restored government. Behind the Republican facade, his new power was still absolute. He paid, and so controlled, virtually the entire army, could veto any legislation that displeased him, and enjoyed unchallengeable personal prestige. His careful observance of traditional forms, however, placated the all-important senatorial aristocracy. The finishing touch was the name Augustus, that is, revered or illustrious one, which he adopted in 27 BCE. This title, with its implications of mortal and even divine authority, was perfectly suited to the princeps' informal brand of autocracy. In 20 BCE, having firmly established his political position in Rome, Augustus decided to enhance his prestige by recovering the eagles Crassus had lost more than 30 years before. Through a combination of negotiation and outright threats, he compelled the Parthians to return the standards. By way of a footnote, shortly thereafter, and perhaps as part of the deal, Augustus sent a beautiful Italian courtesan to the Parthian court, who soon became the Shah's favorite wife. Years later, after giving birth to the Shah's son, she would poison her husband and become Queen of Parthia. Anyway, back in Rome, Augustus displayed the recovered eagles in the Temple of Mars the Avenger, and began to construct the arch whose foundations you've been staring at for the past 5 minutes. Although the entire superstructure was destroyed during the Renaissance, we know from coins that a bronze likeness of Augustus, standing in a chariot pulled by 4 rearing horses, was placed over the central entrance, and that statues of Parthians holding the recovered eagles stood on either side. Like so many other aspects of Augustan propaganda, the arch celebrated the restoration of Roman power and glory. The message was reinforced by the inscriptions built into the arch's central passage, which listed every man who had served as consul or celebrated a triumph. These inscriptions, salvaged from the ruins in 1546, under the direction of Michelangelo, can still be seen in the Capitoline museums, a testament to Augustus's determination to make his reign seem the natural conclusion of Roman history. The small round building in front of you, partially reconstructed by Mussolini in 1930, is the Temple of Vesta, one of the oldest and most sacred sites in Rome. The ancient origins of the building are reflected in its circular plan, which imitates the shape of an Iron Age hut. Vesta was revered as the protector of the harvest and the guardian of Rome. Her temple housed the sacred hearth of the city, where an eternal flame burned. The keepers of the flame were the 6 Vestal virgins. Chosen from Rome's leading families, the Vestals served the goddess for 30 years, after which they were free to re-enter public life and even to marry. As their name suggests, however, they were to remain chaste throughout their time of service. Any Vestal who failed to do so was buried alive, and her lover was beaten to death. As long as they managed to avoid that unpleasant fate, the Vestals held an honored place in Roman society. They received a large salary from the state, enjoyed the privilege, shared only with empresses, of traveling in a carriage within the walls of Rome, and had seats of honor at the Colosseum and Circus Maximus. Their chief duty was to maintain Vesta's sacred fire, which cannot have been easy on rainy days, since the flame was located just below an open roof vent. The Vestals were also responsible for guarding the wills of Rome's most prominent citizens. Caesar deposited his will with them, and Octavian later took the scandalous step of forcing the Vestals to surrender the will of Marcus Antonius. The Vestals were also responsible for overseeing a number of ancient rituals. During the festival of Vesta in June, for example, they invited every married woman in Rome to enter the shrine and offer sacrifice, barefoot, before the sacred flame. In matters of ritual, the Vestals were under the direction of Rome's highest priest, the Pontifex Maximus. The origins of the priest's title, which literally means chief bridge builder, are obscure. There was never any doubt, however, about his power and prestige. Thus, despite an apparently complete lack of belief in the Roman gods, Julius Caesar campaigned fiercely for the job, and served as Pontifex Maximus for the last 20 years of his life. Augustus followed his example, as did every other Roman emperor through the 4th century. Although the title eventually became a virtual formality, Augustus took his duties as Pontifex quite seriously. Working from the Regia, the building that once stood on the foundations across the street from the Shrine of Vesta, Augustus revived or invented a series of ancient festivals, enforced long-neglected sacred laws, and supervised the reconstruction of no fewer than 82 temples. Augustus's massive investment in construction reflected the nature of his authority. Although his power ultimately derived from the legions, his legitimacy was founded on traditional Roman institutions, and thus tied closely to the ancient capital. It was especially vital for him to leave his mark on the Forum, the heart of the old republic. This he did gradually over the course of his long reign, not by any dramatic reconfiguration, but by opportunistically rebuilding existing structures. Virtually every building on the Forum Square was either completed or rebuilt during his reign. Augustus also added, as we have seen, a few carefully placed new monuments to make his own achievements part of Roman history. The finishing touches were additions intended to enhance the prestige of his heirs, of which the most prominent was the rebuilt Temple of Castor, our final building. The 3 surviving columns of the Temple of Castor and Pollux have been a landmark since at least the Middle Ages, and feature prominently in the many romantic landscapes, or vedute, made of the Forum in the 17th and 18th centuries. This temple, originally almost 100 feet tall at the gable, was dedicated to Castor and Pollux, twin demigods who were said to have helped the Romans defeat a coalition of neighboring cities at the Battle of Lake Regillus in 496 BCE. From 145 BCE onward, the Roman people voted on the passage of new laws in the front portico of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, walking 2 by 2 to the ballot box up temporary wooden gangways. In the waning years of the Republic, voting was often a turbulent process. It became customary for the sponsors of a controversial bill to station gangs of thugs around the temple to keep opponents at bay. When Caesar was consul in 59 BCE, for example, he stationed himself on the temple portico to supervise voting on an agrarian law, and watched as his fellow consul, who had run forward to stop the bill's passage, was savagely beaten by his guards at the base of the temple steps. The following year, Clodius, the man who would later be cremated in front of the old Curia, actually barricaded himself inside the temple with a band of armed retainers. Fascinating though these late Republican scandals are, our chief interest in the Temple of Castor lies in its connection with dynastic politics, since the temple as we see it was built and dedicated by Tiberius, Augustus' stepson and reluctant heir. Always sickly, and aware that his imperial system would crumble the instant he died if not left to a credible heir, Augustus spent the greater part of his reign searching for a successor. Early on, he arranged a marriage between Julia, his only child, and his chosen heir Marcellus. Marcellus, however, died young, and so, without missing a beat, Augustus married Julia off to his friend Agrippa. Two of the sons produced by this marriage, Gaius and Lucius, became Augustus' new chosen heirs, but Agrippa died prematurely. Augustus immediately ordered poor Julia to marry yet again, this time to his stepson Tiberius. Tiberius, the son of Augustus' wife Livia, had served for years as a victorious general in the eastern provinces and along the Danube. A solitary and morose figure, he had few friends, and relied heavily on his beloved wife Vipsania. But when Augustus ordered him to divorce Vipsania and marry Julia, he had no choice but to obey. His marriage to Julia was stillborn. Although he continued to campaign brilliantly in Germany, he grew increasingly estranged from his new wife, and thus from Augustus. Finally, in defiance of the princeps' wishes, Tiberius withdrew into self-imposed exile on the Greek island of Rhodes. In the meantime, Julia, tired of being a dynastic pawn, and apparently seeking to sabotage her father's succession plans, took a series of lovers. Scandalized rumor reported that she presided over wild midnight orgies in the Forum Square, and took lovers on the Rostra itself. Forced to choose between saving his daughter and maintaining his public image, Augustus never hesitated. Julia was sent to exile on a small island off the Italian coast. Years later, when Tiberius became emperor, he had her starved to death. Not deprived of his only daughter, Augustus pinned his dynastic hopes on his grandsons Gaius and Lucius. The boys showed great promise, until both died in freak accidents. Now desperate, Augustus recalled Tiberius from Rhodes, and finally recognized him as his heir. 2 years later, to improve his public image, Tiberius rebuilt the Temple of Castor, following, as always, reluctantly, in his stepfather's footsteps. In 14 CE, toward the end of the month recently renamed Augustus in his honor, the body of Imperator Caesar Augustus, princeps and father of his country, was carried into the Forum. The closed coffin, borne by senators, was crowned by a life-size wax effigy of the deceased, which glistened wetly in the heat. Behind came members of the Julian family, wearing the death masks of their eminent ancestors. Conspicuous by his absence was Julius Caesar. It would have been impious to wear the mask of a god. Behind the family walked men dressed as the great heroes of Roman history, from Romulus to Pompey. The emperor's bier was set on the rostra, and Tiberius, looking even more somber than usual, climbed the podium of Caesar's temple to deliver the eulogy. His hard, clipped voice echoing over the Forum Square, he described his stepfather's long life and many achievements. Just behind, through the open doors of the temple, a colossal gilded statue of Caesar gazed over the crowd. On the pediment, 60 feet above, glowed a bronze likeness of the comet, said to have carried Caesar's soul to join the gods. When Tiberius finished, Augustus's funeral couch was slowly and reverentially lifted from the rostra and carried toward the colossal pyre built to receive it on the Campus Martius. The family and costumed Roman heroes followed behind, and then the entire Senate, purple-striped togas streaked with sweat. The equestrians, Rome's other elite class, came behind, followed by the commoners in their hundreds of thousands. As it advanced across the Forum Square, the procession must have seemed a perfect reflection of the conquered world and ordered society of Augustan propaganda, and a fitting tribute to the man who had remade the Roman Empire, and the Roman Forum, in his own image.